My former roommate is freaking me out. What should I do? Hi there. I'm here to share a story that's been quite unsettling for me. It all started when I lived in a house with 5 other people, including John, who was 30 years old, and David, who I began dating last year. As my relationship with David blossomed, John's behavior took a turn for the worse. Initially, everything seemed fine, but as David and I grew closer, John began to express hostility towards me. I suspected that he had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, which only intensified after I made some comments about drunk driving. Having lost friends and property due to drunk driving incidents, I felt strongly about my stance, but it seemed to deepen John's animosity towards me. Things escalated dramatically during a wine tasting trip with the housemates. While everyone else indulged, I chose to stay sober, and that's when John completely lost it. In a public parking lot, he erupted in anger, yelling at me and David, claiming that our relationship made him uncomfortable and that everyone in the house felt the same way. He insisted that he had discussed us with his coworkers, who supposedly agreed with his sentiments. As he raged on, I felt a mix of confusion and fear. He even flipped me off multiple times, shouting insults. David and I decided to leave him behind, opting to drive home together, feeling the weight of the awkwardness in the air. After talking to our other housemates, it became clear that John's claims were unfounded. They had no issue with David and me being together. In the following weeks, I tried my best to avoid John. He reached out to apologize, but I ignored him. Eventually, he cornered me one day, attempting to explain his behavior by blaming it on stress and alcohol. He mentioned he was seeing a therapist, which I found hard to take seriously given the intensity of his outburst. Fast forward a few months, and while we managed to coexist in the same space, the tension was palpable. I decided to move out, hoping that would ease the situation. However, it only seemed to worsen. John's discomfort around me became more pronounced. He would leave the room if I entered, and his hostility was evident in his body language and comments. After a couple of months of living separately, I visited the house again to spend time with David and our friends. I was excited to catch up, but John's behavior was unsettling. He seemed to be on edge, unable to relax around me. At one point, while I was chatting with another housemate, John walked through the kitchen, greeted them, and then retreated to his room. Moments later, we heard him shout a harsh, "Fuck off," from his bedroom, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was directed at me. Throughout the evening, John's discomfort was palpable. He exhaled loudly, as if my presence was physically painful for him. When I greeted another housemate enthusiastically, he muttered under his breath for me to leave. It was bizarre and frankly frightening behavior for a 30-year-old man. Given that John is much larger and stronger than I am, I felt apprehensive about confronting him directly. David, wanting to maintain peace in the house, didn't want to escalate the situation, but I was beginning to feel scared. I loved visiting my friends, but John's behavior was becoming untenable. I found myself at a crossroads, unsure of how to proceed. Should I reach out to our landlord for help? Would it be wise to sit down with John and David to discuss this? The situation felt increasingly precarious, and I needed to find a way to navigate this unsettling dynamic without compromising my safety or my friendships. I want to share a story that took place a couple of years ago, one that really opened my eyes to the importance of safety and self-respect in relationships. At the time, I was 22 years old and living with a boyfriend named David, who was friends with a guy named John. John was 30, and while I had initially thought he was just a quirky roommate, things took a turn that left me feeling uneasy. It all started when I began to notice John's behavior. He was often aggressive, especially when he drank, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was unstable. I remember one evening when I was at David's place, and John just exploded in anger over something trivial. It was shocking to see someone react that way, and I couldn't help but feel afraid. I worried that one day he might lash out in a way that could hurt me or someone else. I confided in my friends and family about my concerns, and they echoed the same sentiment. I needed to be careful around him. They suggested I avoid going over to David's place, especially when John was around. It was a tough pill to swallow because I wanted to maintain my friendships, but my safety had to come first. I had a conversation with David about how I felt, but I realized that I hadn't communicated my fears clearly enough before. After our talk, he promised to come over to my place more often, and I decided that I would only attend larger gatherings where I wouldn't be alone with John. As time went on, I noticed that the dynamics in the house were strange. Most of the roommates were in their mid-20s to 30s, and it seemed like John was lagging behind in life. He was living with multiple roommates, drinking excessively, and exhibiting behavior that was concerning. I began to feel like I was a target for his frustrations. It was as if my presence and my relationship with David made him feel inadequate. I tried to be more cautious, making sure I was never alone with John. David even suggested that I stay in his room while he fetched food, which made me feel a little safer. But I still felt the weight of the situation. The other roommates seemed passive, perhaps even scared of John, and I couldn't help but feel like I was the only one who recognized how problematic he was. Fast forward a few months, and I decided to take a step back. I realized that I was uncomfortable going to David's place, and I showed him the post I had made online, where I had shared my experiences and fears. The comments from others really highlighted how serious the situation was, and David agreed that I shouldn't have to feel this way. He started coming over to my place more, but as time passed, it became easier for him to slip back into old habits, asking me to come over again. Eventually, I recognized that the situation hadn't improved. John never offered a genuine apology, and while I was fortunate that nothing physical ever happened, the emotional toll was significant. I began to feel trapped in a relationship that wasn't serving me well. I realized that I was allowing myself to be treated poorly, not just by John, but also by David, who didn't stand up for me when I needed support. After some soul-searching and a desire for change, I made the difficult decision to end my relationship with David. I moved away, seeking a new environment and a fresh start. During the quarantine period, I took the time to reflect on my life and my identity. I discovered more about myself and my sexuality, and I eventually began dating a wonderful woman who was thoughtful and supportive. Looking back, I see how I was gaslit into thinking that John's behavior wasn't as bad as it was, all in an effort to keep the peace in the house. It was a tough lesson, but I'm grateful for the growth that came from it. My life is so much better now, and I've learned the importance of prioritizing my safety and well-being above all else. Let me take you back to a time when I was living with my former roommate, John. At first, everything seemed fine, but as time went on, I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable around him. He was a 30-year-old man, and I was just 22, trying to navigate my early 20s while sharing a space with someone who was, quite frankly, not the best influence. As the pandemic hit and we were all forced into lockdown, I found myself grappling with deep existential anxiety. It was during this time that I realized just how toxic my living situation had become. I was surrounded by a circle of friends that I ultimately decided to cut ties with. And honestly, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knew I had to prioritize my mental health and well-being. Eventually, I made the decision to break up with my boyfriend, David. It was a tough choice, but I knew it was necessary for my happiness. After that, I moved away, leaving behind not just John, but everyone from that toxic circle. It felt liberating to finally cut off contact with people who were dragging me down. As I settled into my new life, I began to discover more about myself. I realized that I was gay, a revelation that brought me a sense of clarity and joy. Life was finally drama-free, and I felt like I was on the right path. Of course, I still had to come out to my family, which was a whole different adventure, but I was ready to embrace who I truly was. The overwhelming support I received from others during this time was incredible. I never expected my story to resonate with so many people. I even found myself thinking about John and David. I hoped that David was doing well, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of concern for John, who I knew was struggling with his own issues, including alcohol and substance use. Looking back, I realized that I had made the right choices for myself. I was no longer in a toxic environment, and I was excited about the future. I had a newfound sense of freedom and self-acceptance, and I was ready to face whatever came next. Life was good, and I was finally living it on my own terms.